Underneath your calm, beneath your routine, your prayers, your songs of worship, something is screaming. And the most terrifying part is, you can't even name it. You're not broken. You're not faithless. But deep inside, there's a noise that never stops. A noise that no one else hears. Because you've learned how to look okay. You've mastered the smile. You've memorized the verses. You show up to church. You sing louder than most. But when the silence comes, when the lights go out, when the world stops distracting you, something tightens in your chest. Something you can't explain. That's the place where a trauma without a memory lives. Not all pain leaves a trace. Not all wounds bleed. Some just stay stuck in the corners of your soul, like old furniture you've forgotten how to move. And yet, they rearrange the whole room. You may not remember the moment it happened. Maybe you were too young, too scared, or too proud to admit it. But your body remembers. Your patterns remember. The way you flinch when someone gets too close. The way you downplay your emotions before they even leave your mouth. The way you feel guilty for being sad. These are not just habits. These are survival mechanisms, ghosts in your nervous system that wear the mask of strength. You thought you'd gotten over it. You told yourself it was in the past. But trauma doesn't live in years. It lives in reaction. It lives in the way you can't trust good things to stay. It shows up in the way you self-sabotage every time love gets too real. It whispers when you try to pray deeply, but something shuts down in your chest. Something clenches, and you blame yourself. You think it's a lack of faith, or maybe even a hidden sin, but it's not. It's a bruise on your spirit that has never had the words to speak up. Freud once wrote that forgotten trauma doesn't disappear, it becomes fate. What he meant is this: whatever pain you couldn't process will find a way to repeat itself. Not because you're cursed, but because your soul is trying to tell its story. Even if you won't listen, it will find ways to scream. In your anxiety, in your nightmares, in your refusal to rest, even in your perfectionism. That's not discipline. That's panic in disguise. You don't trust rest because rest feels unsafe. Stillness feels like exposure, and you've spent your whole life running from what it might show you. There's a reason you can't stand silent. There's a reason you always need music, podcasts, voices. There's a reason you check your phone every 5 minutes, even when nothing is happening. Because silence is where the echoes live, and those echoes are old. Maybe you were hurt by someone who was supposed to protect you. Maybe you were humiliated in a moment when you needed safety. Maybe your first experience of God was filtered through punishment, fear, or rejection. And now, your spirit confuses divine presence with emotional threat. Your soul flinches at intimacy because it's waiting for the blow. And you don't talk about this because even you don't fully understand it. You just feel tired, disconnected, like you're faking your way through faith. And you hate that feeling. You try harder, you fast more. You confess things you're not even sure are sins. You volunteer, you give, you stay busy. But none of it quiets the storm. Because the storm isn't a punishment, it's a signal. Your soul is trying to show you something it wasn't safe to feel when it first happened. That little version of you, the one who froze when things got painful, is still waiting to be seen. And no amount of spiritual discipline will erase what needs to be embraced. Healing doesn't come from pretending it never hurt. Healing comes from giving voice to what never got to speak. And that's where many of us are stuck. We believe in God's power to redeem anything, except the things we've tried to forget. We think if we dig too deep, we'll lose control. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the control was the real prison all along. People think trauma is only about what was done to us, but sometimes it's also about what we never got. Affection, safety, validation. And when we spiritualize our way out of our own stories, we miss the invitation God gives us to heal from the inside out. You were never meant to carry this alone. You were never meant to pretend you were unscathed. Faith doesn't require denial. It requires honesty. But most of us have learned to perform faith, not live it. We've learned to put on spiritual armor, not to open our wounds in sacred spaces. Have you ever wondered why certain parts of Scripture make you uncomfortable? Why verses about intimacy with God feel threatening instead of comforting? It's because your subconscious is still guarding places that were once invaded. Your heart built walls before you even knew what walls were. You prayed for peace, but built a fortress. And now, that same fortress is suffocating you. You want God to enter, but you don't know how to open the door without everything falling apart. What if falling apart isn't the end, but the beginning? You've been praying for clarity, but clarity can't come where shame still lives, because shame doesn't just silence you, it distorts you. It takes what happened to you and turns it into something about you. You're not just someone who was neglected. You're someone who must not be lovable. You're not just someone who was criticized. You're someone who must never be good enough. And suddenly, your prayers stop being honest. They turn into performances. You're not praying to connect. You're praying to prove you're not broken. But God doesn't want your act. He wants your ache. Many of us were taught to fear what we feel. We learned that emotions are messy, weak, or even sinful. So instead of feeling grief, we quote verses about joy. Instead of admitting anger, we smile harder and call it patience. Instead of confessing fear, we bury ourselves in the illusion of control. We spiritualize our symptom. We rebuke what we should be embracing. And slowly, we lose the ability to hear ourselves. Have you ever wondered why you cry during worship and don't know why? Or why your heart races when someone prays over you? Or why you feel a sudden sadness after a spiritual breakthrough? It's not because something's wrong with you. It's because something deep inside is being touched for the first time, and it doesn't have words yet. It just weeps. It trembles. It leaks out of you like a language your mind forgot, but your soul remembered. Freud believed that unprocessed trauma doesn't just vanish, it comes back as repetition. You don't remember what happened, but you relive it in new forms. That's why you keep attracting people who abandon you. That's why you keep sabotaging blessings. That's why you always feel safest when you're busy, distracted, or numb. The past isn't in the past when it still controls the present. And this is where the spiritual and psychological intersect in the most powerful and painful way. You might say you've forgiven. You might say you've moved on. But if the memory still makes your body tense, you're not healed. If a certain tone of voice makes your stomach tighten, you're not free. If receiving love still feels like danger, then something old is still alive. And it's not your fault. Healing isn't about blaming, it's about noticing, because you can't change what you won't name. And God doesn't heal the mask, He heals the real. There's a verse in the Psalms that says, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." But most of us don't feel that nearness, not because God is far, but because we don't know how to be broken with Him. We were taught to bring our victories to the altar, not our vulnerability. We were taught to give praise, not panic. But true faith invites God into the rawest places, where the pain is still bleeding and the questions still sting. Think of how many times you've heard someone say, "Just trust God," and maybe you did, maybe you do. But trust is not just a decision, it's a nervous system condition. If your trauma taught you that intimacy equals danger, then even your trust in God will be laced with hesitation. Not because you don't believe, but because your body is still bracing for impact. Your spirit knows how to trust, but your trauma has trained you to flinch. That's not rebellion, that's programming. And here's where it gets deeper. When trauma remains unhealed, faith becomes a strategy to escape, not to encounter. You start using Bible verses like shields instead of bridges. You recite scriptures not to feel God, but to suppress the fear of feeling at all. Your theology becomes a fortress, not a home. And in that fortress, you slowly suffocate, because the God you're hiding from is the only one who knows how to set you free. Have you ever had a moment where someone saw you, not the polished version of you, but the shattered parts, and didn't run? That moment is sacred, because it undoes the lie that says, you are only loved when you're strong. And if a human can offer that kind of grace, how much more your Creator? God doesn't recoil from your mess. He doesn't need you to explain your panic or justify your sorrow. He just wants to sit with, to hold it, to remind you that the parts you're ashamed of are the very places He wants to dwell. But it's hard to let Him in when your first instinct is to hide. That instinct didn't come from nowhere. It came from moments when being open cost, when honesty was punished, when vulnerability was weaponized. So now you armor up, especially in spiritual spaces. You say the right thing. You avoid oversharing. You act composed, but inside, you're screaming. And maybe you've even started to believe that the scream is who you are. It's not. It's a symptom. It's a cry from a part of you that was silenced before it ever had a chance to grow. And the good news? God doesn't heal by shaming that part. He heals by listening to it, by holding it, by giving it space to breathe without fear of being rejected. And slowly, you begin to realize that healing isn't about being more spiritual. It's about being more real. Realness is the soil where resurrection happens. It's not pretty, it's not polished, but it's holy. Because God doesn't resurrect what you pretend to be. He resurrects what actually died. And until you give Him access to the places you've buried, you'll keep wondering why your faith feels heavy instead of healing. And maybe that's where we need to pause. Not to perform, not to fix, but to feel. There's something profoundly exhausting about pretending you're okay in a place that was supposed to be your sanctuary. And yet, that's where so many people find themselves. In church, in prayer, in front of others, wearing a smile that doesn't reach their eyes, reciting verses that never seem to reach their heart. Not because they don't believe, but because they've been trained to believe that what they feel is dangerous, that to cry too much, to question too hard, or to tremble in the presence of God somehow means you're failing at faith. But what if the trembling wasn't failure? It was an invitation. Think about it. We're taught to be strong in the Lord, but no one tells you what to do when you can't even stand, when your body shakes for no reason, when you cry during a worship song and don't know why, when you open your Bible and feel a wall, not a word. It's in those moments we start to think something's wrong with us, that maybe we've drifted, maybe we've lost it. But what if that feeling isn't abandoned? It's access. Because true healing doesn't happen when you feel ready. It happens when the wound has no more room to hide, and maybe that's what's happening now. Maybe you're not losing faith, you're losing the ability to fake it. Maybe you're not far from God. You're just finally close enough for Him to touch the pain you've been trying to pray your way around. There's a reason your chest gets tight when someone asks how you're really doing. There's a reason silence feels unbearable. There's a reason your prayers sound scripted. It's not spiritual immaturity, it's trauma. It's a history your nervous system remembers, even when your memory doesn't. And trauma doesn't vanish because you said a prayer. It heals through permission, through presence, through practice, and yes, through God. But not the version of Him you learned to fear, the version who sits in your chaos and doesn't ask you to clean it up before He'll come closer. Freud had this concept he called the return of the repressed. The idea that what we push down doesn't go away. It simply shows up later, in disguised forms, in panic attacks, in overreactions, in addictions, in spiritual numbness. And if we're not careful, we'll start praying for God to remove the very things that are actually alerting us to the real wound. What if that anxiety is your soul waving a white flag? What if your depression is the grief you weren't allowed to express 10 years ago? What if your spiritual dryness is the result of bypassing emotion for doctrine? This isn't weakness. This is the body being honest. And God is not offended by your honesty. In fact, He often does His deepest work in the spaces where you finally stop trying to hold it together. Let me ask you something. Have you ever had a moment where you completely broke down in private, but felt more connected to God than you did in a month of polished prayers? That wasn't a coincidence. That was a glimpse of truth. That was your soul remembering what it's like to be seen. Because God doesn't meet you at the surface of your faith. He meets you in the cracks, in the groan, in the sighs too deep for words. That's where the Spirit intercedes. But we've been conditioned to distrust our feeling, to separate our faith from our bodies. We treat the tears as distraction, the rage as rebellion, the confusion as evidence of spiritual failure. And we forget that Jesus Himself wept, that He overturned tables, that He sweated blood. Emotion was never the enemy. It was always part of the embodiment of truth. The enemy wants you silent, polite, performance-driven. Because as long as you're managing your image, you'll never be vulnerable enough to be transformed. Satan doesn't need you to abandon your faith. He just needs you to hide behind it, to use your spiritual language as a wall instead of a window, to memorize verses but forget how to be human. Because when your faith becomes a mask, you'll start to suffocate beneath it. But here's where something beautiful happens. The moment you decide that feeling doesn't disqualify you, but frees you, that's when the shift begins. That's when shame loses its grip. That's when old patterns start to crumble. Because you're no longer trying to escape the discomfort, you're finally sitting with it. And that's where the healing begins. Not in the escape, but in the embrace. It's the moment you say, "I'm tired of pretending." The moment you whisper, "God, if you're real, meet me here in this mess." The moment you admit, "I don't even know what I feel anymore, but I'm done fighting it." That's holy ground. Not because it's pretty, but because it's honest. And honesty is the language of restoration. You might still be wondering, but isn't it wrong to feel so much? Doesn't God want me to have peace, not panic? Yes, but peace isn't the absence of, it's the presence of love in the panic. It's the ability to say, "I am terrified, and I am held. I am overwhelmed, and I am not alone. I don't understand this, but I am still worth loving." And once that becomes real to you, not just theologically, but experientially, everything starts to shift. Your prayers deepen, your relationships soften, your inner critic begins to lose its volume, because now you're not just surviving, you're becoming, you're integrating, you're allowing your faith to reach the places your fear used to rule. And that is resurrection in real time. It's strange, isn't it? How you can be surrounded by people, even people who love you, and still feel like something inside you is missing. Not missing like a thing you lost, but missing like a person you've never met. And that person is you. You say you feel alone, but maybe what you're actually feeling is the weight of being disconnected, not from others, but from yourself. Because loneliness doesn't always come from the absence of people. Sometimes it comes from the absence of presence, your own presence, the kind that requires stillness, the kind that doesn't depend on performance, the kind that waits with you in silence, without trying to fix anything. Most of us never learned how to be with ourselves. We learned how to manage our image. We learned how to anticipate what other people want from us. We learned how to avoid conflict, please others, look strong, quote scripture, stay busy, keep going. But sit with ourselves, without distraction, without a screen, a plan, a prayer list. That's terrifying. Because in that stillness, something begins to echo. The ache we buried, the voice we silenced, the fear we disguised as discipline, the truth that maybe, just maybe, we don't really know who we are when no one's watching. That silence, for some, feels like death. But what if it's actually the birthplace of life? There's a moment when the noise dies down, the applause stops. The friends aren't calling, the platform is quiet, the ministry feels dry, and you're left sitting with the version of yourself that you don't curate, the one that can't be edited or spiritualized or explained away. That's when the real work starts. That's when the questions come, the ones you've been dodging with verses and activity and external validation. Who am I if I'm not helping anyone right now? What's left of me if I stop pretending to be okay? Do I even know what I like, what I need, what I believe, when no one is prompting me? It's here that many people panic. They rush back into noise, back into ministry, back into hustle, back into relationships that distract, because silence reveals what you've successfully hidden, not just from others, but from yourself. And that's the paradox. The deeper you go into yourself, the more you uncover the God who never left, the one who was never afraid of your emptiness, who wasn't waiting for your words, but for your willingness, who wasn't expecting you to arrive perfect but honest. The early Christian mystics used to call this journey the desert, not a place of punishment, but of purification, a place where the soul detaches from illusion, where what once looked like abandonment is really a sacred reset, where all the scaffolding you use to prop yourself up begins to fall, not to shame you, but to finally show you what's underneath. Who's underneath? You, not the you they told you to be. Not the version of you that always knows what to say, how to act, how to please, but the raw, real, radiant self that still exists beneath the rubble. The self who isn't afraid to say, "I don't know." The self who can sit in grief and not try to fix it. The self who no longer performs faith but embodies it, quietly, deeply, honestly. That's the self God longs to meet. But to get there, you have to go through the silence, through the ache, through the unlearning. Let's be real for a second. Some of you haven't been alone in years. Not really alone. You've always had something to check, someone to respond to, a sermon to listen to, a video to watch, a post to make, a task to complete. And when the moment comes that your phone dies or your schedule clears, you feel an internal shaking, not from boredom, from withdrawal, because somewhere along the way, your identity got attached to external stimuli. And without it, you don't know how to just be. But here's the truth. You cannot heal in a room you keep escaping. You cannot meet the presence of God in a place you refuse to inhabit. Solitude is not the same as isolation. Isolation disconnects you from love. Solitude reconnects you to it. It's not about shutting people out. It's about letting yourself in, giving your inner life the space to breathe again, letting the child within you speak, letting the silence say what your words never could. And that's where the fear begins to loosen its grip. Because you start to realize you are not your productivity. You are not your appearance. You are not your opinions. You are not even your trauma. You are the one who witnesses all of that. You are the one still breathing beneath the debris. You are the one Jesus came for, not the polished you, the performing you, the praying too loud in public you, but the you that sits quietly in the dark and whispers, "I'm tired." And in that whisper, He's already there. Some of the most profound encounters with God don't happen in a crowd or at a pulpit. They happen in the ordinary, at a kitchen sink, on a walk, at night when you can't sleep, in the shower, when no one's asking for anything. They happen not because you recited the right prayer, but because for a split second, you were honest, unfiltered, still, present. And that's the beginning of reconnection. Not just with God, but with you. Because maybe, just maybe, you weren't created to live externally for everyone else. Maybe you were created to know the sacredness of your own soul, to walk with God in the cool of your own garden, and to realize that what you've been chasing, peace, clarity, worth, was never out there. It was always waiting, right here, in the quietest part of you. That's where we're going next, and you'll want to be there for what's coming. There comes a moment in every journey where the question isn't, "Where am I going?" but rather, "Am I finally willing to stop running?" We run so much, toward achievements, relationships, validation. We run from silence, from pain, from ourselves. We even run toward faith, hoping it will act like a fire escape out of our emotional chaos. But sometimes, the faith we cling to isn't healing us anymore. It's just helping us hide better. And no one told you that faith could become a mask, that quoting verses could become a shield, not a connection. That ministry could be a way of avoiding intimacy. That worship could feel safer than confession. That you could memorize the Bible, speak in tongues, serve for years, and still feel spiritually exhausted. Not because your belief is broken, but because your faith stopped being a relationship and became a performance. There's a type of faith that doesn't comfort anymore. It burdens. It feels heavy, like armor that was once useful, but now just makes it hard to move. You wear it every day, smile through it, lead with it, but deep down, you're tired. Not tired of God, tired of how you've had to carry Him, and no one knows. Because from the outside, you still look spiritual. You still pray before meals. You still say the right thing, but on the inside, you're barely breathing. Not because you've lost faith, but because you've never been given permission to lay it down. Just for a moment, just to catch your breath, just to admit that maybe you need to stop fighting and start feeling again. Freud once said, "Unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways." Some of you have been using faith to bury your emotion. You've mistaken repression for holiness. You've called numbness peace. You've confused silence with surrender. And now, that buried grief is showing up in your body, in your insomnia, in your anxiety, in your anger, in your disconnection. And maybe just maybe, in your inability to feel God the way you used to. Because you never healed, you hid, and faith became the hiding place. But here's the truth you were never told. God doesn't need your armor. He never asked for your perfection. He isn't threatened by your honesty. In fact, the parts of you that you've been taught to conceal, your confusion, your rage, your question, your collapse, those are the places where He wants to meet you most. You think your doubt disqualifies you, but it doesn't. It invites you. You think your fatigue makes you weak, but it doesn't. It makes you real. And that is the beginning of transformation. Not when you climb higher, but when you stop pretending. When you stop rehearsing faith like a script and start living it like a relationship. One that breathes, one that listens, one that feels. Do you know what God whispered to Elijah after the prophet collapsed under the weight of exhaustion? He didn't rebuke him. He didn't demand more faith. He sent an angel, not with a sermon, but with a meal, with rest, with compassion. That's how God responds to a tired soul. And that's how you should respond to yourself. You don't need to try harder. You need to soften. You need to feel. You need to cry the tears you've been shoving into spiritual language. You need to admit the fear behind the verses you recite. You need to tell the truth about how heavy it's become, how you're not doubting God, but you're doubting that He still wants you. Like this. Fractured, spent, numb. But what if this is the version of you that God's been waiting to hold? Not the one who's on fire, the one who's burnt out, not the one preaching hope, the one losing it, not the one building a platform, the one sitting alone, questioning everything. That's where healing begins. Not at the peak of your performance, but at the edge of your vulnerability, where all the pretending falls off, where the armor comes loose, and you finally exhale the breath you've been holding for years. You are not backsliding. You are breaking open. You are not weak in faith. You are weary from the war, and there's no shame in that. Only space. Space to rest, to feel, to return, not to the religion you were taught to wear like a costume, but to the God who still walks in the cool of the garden, whispering your name, not to fix you, not to push you, but to sit with you in your humanity, in your holy exhaustion, because He knows. He knows what you've been carrying. He knows how hard you've been trying. He knows how alone you've felt in rooms full of worship. He knows how long you've been pretending it's all okay, and He's not disappointed. He's not impatient. He's not asking you to do more. He's asking you to let go, to stop being a soldier for a moment and just be His child, to stop guarding your heart with theology and start opening it with trust, to stop making faith your shield and start letting it be your healing. This is your invitation to come out of hiding, to peel off the layers, to remember that faith was never supposed to be armor forever. It was supposed to be a bridge. And on the other side of that bridge is peace. Not the fake peace of spiritual appearance, but the real, raw, quiet kind that can only be felt once the war inside you ends. And maybe that's what you've been looking for all along. The place where you no longer to perform faith because you've finally encountered it.